The morning sun filtered through the lace curtains of the old Victorian house, casting gentle shadows across the hardwood floors that George had polished just yesterday with his own weathered hands, and he stood now in the living room holding a mop like it was the most natural thing in the world, because in truth it was. George Henderson was 72 years old with silver hair that caught the light and deep lines around his eyes that spoke of a lifetime of smiles and sorrows alike, and he had been living with his son Michael for nearly 6 months now. Ever since the small apartment he had called home for 15 years became too expensive on his modest pension. Michael was a good son, or at least George wanted to believe that, and perhaps he was in his own way. Though lately George rarely saw him between the long hours at the accounting firm and the new relationship that seemed to consume whatever time remained, and that relationship was with Vanessa. Harper was beautiful, in the way that magazines and billboards defined beauty, with perfect hair and clothes that probably cost more than George's entire monthly income, and she had moved in 3 weeks ago after Michael proposed, and from that very first day, something shifted in the house like a cold wind had blown through and never quite left. George didn't mind helping around the house because idle hands had never suited him, and back when his late wife Martha was alive, they had shared every chore with laughter and conversation, turning mundane tasks into moments of connection. And so he cleaned and cooked simple meals and tended the small garden out back where Martha's favorite roses still bloomed each spring. But Vanessa seemed to see his helpfulness as something else entirely. "The floor is still wet here," she would say with that particular tone that made George feel small, and he would apologize and mop it again, even though he knew it was already spotless. "Did you really think that was clean? Enough," she would ask, gesturing at a countertop or a window, and George would nod quietly and do it over because arguing never made anything better, and he had learned that lesson long ago. This particular morning, George had woken early as older folks often do when sleep becomes a lighter thing, and he had made coffee in the old percolator that Michael kept threatening to replace with one of those fancy pod machines, and the smell reminded George of Sunday mornings with Martha when the whole world seemed to move at a gentler pace. He was mopping the living room floor when he heard Vanessa's heels clicking down the stairs, and his heart sank just a little because he knew what was coming, and he braced himself the way you might brace for cold water. "You're mopping again," she said, and there was something in her voice that wasn't quite a question and wasn't quite a statement, but fell somewhere in between like an accusation. "Just keeping things tidy," George replied softly, and he tried to smile at her the way he smiled at everyone because his mother had taught him that kindness costs nothing and sometimes it's the only currency that matters. "You missed a spot there." Vanessa pointed with one perfectly manicured nail, and George looked where she indicated and saw nothing but clean floor gleaming in the morning light. But he nodded anyway. "I'll get that," he said. "You know what, George?" Vanessa said, and she crossed her arms in that way that made her look even more formidable. "Maybe you should consider that this constant cleaning makes it seem like you're trying to earn your keep here, and it's a bit pathetic, honestly." The words hit George like small stones, and he felt something twist in his chest, but he kept his face neutral because showing hurt only ever made people like Vanessa more cruel, and he had learned that too over these past weeks. "I just want to help," he said quietly. "Help would be staying out of the way," she replied, and then she walked past him into the kitchen, her heels leaving small marks on the floor he had just cleaned. George stood there for a long moment with the mop in his hands, and he thought about Martha and how she would have handled someone like Vanessa with grace, probably, and firm boundaries definitely, and he missed her so much in that moment that it felt like a physical ache. But he was tired and he was old, and fighting battles had never been his way. The days continued like this, with Vanessa finding new ways to make George feel like an intruder in what had been his son's home, and sometimes he wondered if Michael noticed, but his son was so busy and so distracted and so clearly in love that George couldn't bring himself to say anything. "Dad, you don't have to do all this cleaning," Michael would say occasionally, but there was no real concern in his voice, just a passing comment made while checking his phone or rushing to another appointment. "I don't mind," George would reply, and that was true in its way because the cleaning gave him purpose even if it also gave Vanessa ammunition. One afternoon, George was on his hands and knees scrubbing the kitchen floor because Vanessa had spilled something and made a comment about how the floor was probably dirty anyway, and he didn't hear Michael come home early from work. "I'm your father," George cried out when he saw his son standing in the doorway, but not in greeting, exactly, more in explanation, because Vanessa was standing over him, with her arms crossed and that look on her face, and George suddenly needed Michael to remember who he was. To remember that he had held Michael as a baby and taught him to ride a bike and sat up with him through fevers and heartbreaks. "What's going on?" Michael asked, and he looked confused and maybe a little embarrassed. "Your father was just cleaning up his mess," Vanessa said smoothly, and George knew he should correct her, but the word stuck in his throat, because who would Michael believe? "It was my spill," George said quietly. "I'm sorry." And he saw something flicker across Michael's face, something that might have been recognition or might have been disappointment, and George couldn't tell which, and that hurt more than anything Vanessa had said. Michael left the room without another word, and George finished cleaning the floor while Vanessa watched with satisfaction in her eyes. That night, George lay in bed in the small room that had once been Michael's childhood bedroom, and he looked at the ceiling and thought about dignity and pride and what it means to be old in a world that doesn't quite know what to do with its elders. He thought about leaving, about finding some small room somewhere and living on his pension, and maybe that would be better than this slow erosion of self. But then he thought about Michael and the good memories and the hope that somehow things might change. 2 weeks later, Michael came home early again, but this time, George was sitting in the garden tending to Martha's roses, and he didn't see his son standing at the window, watching. George was talking to the roses the way he had talked to them for years, telling them about his day and about Martha, and about how much he missed the life they had built together, and his voice was soft and full of a sadness he never let show inside the house. Michael stood there for a long time listening, and something in his chest began to crack open that evening when Vanessa made another cutting remark about George taking too long in the bathroom. Michael didn't let it pass. "Vanessa," he said, and his voice was different, firmer. "That's my father you're talking about." "I'm just saying he could be more considerate," she replied. But there was a note of uncertainty now. "No," Michael said. "You're not being considerate, and I've been blind to it, and I'm sorry." George was standing in the hallway, and he heard this, and tears sprang to his eyes unbidden, because it had been so long since someone had stood up for him. The conversation that followed was long and difficult, and Vanessa didn't understand at first why Michael was suddenly so upset, and maybe she never fully understood, but she began to see that something had to change. Michael sat with his father that night, really sat with him for the first time in months, and they talked about Martha, and about loneliness, and about what it means to need help and what it means to give it. "I'm sorry, Dad," Michael said, and his voice broke. "I've been so caught up in my own life that I forgot to see you. You're busy, son," George said. "I understand." "That's no excuse," Michael replied. "You raised me better than this." And George reached out and put his hand on his son's shoulder, and he felt something settle in his chest that had been unsettled for months. Things didn't change overnight, because real change never does, and Vanessa struggled with the new dynamic where George was treated as a beloved father rather than unpaid help, but Michael was patient and firm, and eventually she began to soften, or perhaps she just began to see George as a person rather than an inconvenience. One morning, George woke to find Michael making coffee in the old percolator, and his son smiled at him and said, "I thought we could have breakfast together before work." And they sat at the kitchen table while the sun rose, and they talked about small things and big things, and George felt more like himself than he had in a very long time. Vanessa came down later, and she paused when she saw them sitting together, and something shifted in her expression, and she poured herself coffee and joined them at the table. "George," she said, and the word came out stiff but genuine. "I wanted to apologize for how I've been treating you, and I was wrong, and I hope you can forgive me." George looked at her, and he saw someone young and scared in her own way, someone who was trying to control everything because she didn't know any other way to feel safe, and he recognized that because he had known people like that before, and maybe he had even been like that himself once. "We all make mistakes," he said gently. "What matters is what we do next, and Vanessa nodded and she reached across the tea.